Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week is particularly exciting because we're talking about Star Trek. I know, we just talked about a Star Trek comic book a few weeks ago, but this one's different. So it's almost Book Track, a fantastic reading event created by Vin over Revenant Reads, which celebrates Star Trek fiction. And that's starting in July, and it's going on all summer. Where all summer long we just, aside from everything else we're doing here on BookTube, we're reading Star Trek books. So it's awesome. It's a lot of fun for those of us who are Star Trek fans. And Roger and I are huge Star Trek fans. So today we're talking about the original Star Trek comic book, the OG Star Trek comic book, the Gold Key Star Trek. And we're talking about the very first issue of Star Trek that was ever created for comic books. And it was really weird, and it was published by Gold Key Comics. And I did read these comics a few years ago. I read some of them when the first Book Trek happened. But I thought I would take another look, because now I have this nice fancy... I've since gotten this nice fancy pants edition of the Gold Key Archives Volume 1, which has the first 6 issues of Star Trek in it. And it's a weird experience reading these really old issues of the Gold Key Star Trek, because nobody who wrote or draw these issues had ever seen Star Trek. I mean, they just had no idea about Star Trek. If you've seen Star Trek once, you know more about this show than the folks who made this comic, which makes it a little bit odd. I think all they had to work with was like, this is a basic idea. Hey, this is what Star Trek is. And a few photographs. Clearly, they were black and white photographs. And so they didn't have a great idea about what Star Trek was. And the very first issue is The Planet of No Return. The writer of this first issue was Dick Wood, who took time off from his regular job as an adult film star to write the first issue of Star Trek. He actually wrote the first few issues of Star Trek, Mr. Wood. And he was joined by Nevio Zakara. Nevio Zakara drew the first couple issues of Star Trek, and then he was replaced by Alberto Giolitti, who... and neither one of these guys had ever seen Star Trek, and they created a very interesting version of Star Trek. First of all, neither one of them knew what anything inside the Enterprise looked like. They had obviously had pictures of the Starship Enterprise, so they knew what the outside of the Enterprise looked like, but they had no clue what the inside of the Enterprise looked like. It was interesting, and it made for an interesting comic book. This is the cover for the very first issue, and Gold Key used these photographs as their covers, just random photos from the show, which, is cool. It's cool. But, usually they have absolutely nothing to do with what's inside the comic book. And we've got Captain Kirk, we've got Sulu, who I don't remember. I don't think he was inside the comic at all, Sulu. But we did have Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. Mr. Spock, who was the breakout character from this television show, is very front and center in all of these Star Trek comics. He is the one character who really stands out. For one thing, he's wearing a different shirt from everybody else. But he is the most interesting character in most of these issues. In this first one, though, he's left on board the ship while the rest of our crew go and have adventures on the planet of no return. Another interesting thing is that Janice Rand is on the planet, although the artist thought that her hair was actually a hat, which is understandable if you've ever seen her hair. And she is the only female character in the comic. In fact, in the first 6 issues of Star Trek, the only female characters you get are Janice Rand, and later on you get Lieutenant Uhura. Although poor Lieutenant Uhura, when she shows up, isn't quite looking herself. There's just something a little off about her, unfortunately, in this comic book. Yeah, it was the old Gold Key comic. What can I tell you? So, well, let me tell you about the first issue of Star Trek and the Planet of No Return. The lack of women isn't the only thing, though, that really shows how progressive how progressive a television show Star Trek was. It was progressive in a lot of ways. And it's interesting when you read this comic, because it's good. I have to say that right up front, that these old Star Trek comics, they're good. They're good stories. But the stories are really kind of throwback stories in a way. They have a real feel of like an old astounding science fiction story from the 30s or 40s. And as far as how alien life is represented and how our crew of space pioneers, as in the first few issues they're sometimes referred to as space pioneers, how the crew of the Starship Enterprise works. It's interesting. So we obviously have a terrible threat in this first issue on the Planet of No Return. So we start off, it's Captain's Log, Stardate 1809.2. They just made up the star dates, I think. Enterprise carrying out exploration mission through Galaxy Alpha. So far, we've seen no indication of life anywhere in the galaxy. So the Starship Enterprise is going throughout the galaxy. Here we have our crew in the Enterprise. Like I said, inside the Enterprise, it doesn't really look like the Enterprise. Our characters, though, are sometimes drawn as they appear on the show because they had some photographs to work with. Obviously, they did here with Captain Kirk. Now, at some point, the Enterprise passes through an eerie space fog. It's an eerie space fog. A mist which floats a handful of strange plant spores that fasten onto the hull of the ship. The one-celled reproductive bodies are so minute and yet so powerful that they seep through the very superstructure. So you have little spores that float through the hull of the Enterprise. Now, one thing I should mention about the poor Starship Enterprise in these early issues is that there are no shields. No shields to protect the Starship Enterprise from anything. In fact, let me show you the first splash page from a later story. So this is a later story, but here we have, sorry about that. Here we have meteorites crashing through the hull of the ship and into the bridge, because nothing protects the ship from meteorites, let alone other ships with weapons. There are no defensive shields at all. It sucks to be on this Enterprise. So Dr. McCoy and Mr. Spock are in the laboratory working, and they've got guinea pigs, because why wouldn't you have guinea pigs? And then suddenly this horrific Lovecraftian thing happens to the guinea pig. It becomes a hideous monster. So the guinea pig is transformed by these spores into this awful, hideous Lovecraftian creature right out of Weird Tales. And they have to deal with that. And instead of calling for security, Mr. Spock calls for guards. Guards! Guards! And so the guards show up, and poor Mr. Spock is being drawn into the suddenly monster plant guinea pig, and they shoot it with their phasers, and they kill it. And Mr. Spock is like, "What the heck's going on?" He's like, "How'd that thing get in here anyway, Mr. Spock? That is something that must be learned. We must know the cause to find the cure, the preventative." And Dr. McCoy's like, we probably should tell the captain about this. So they have a meeting where they talk about what happened. And Mr. Spock says, yeah, it's got to be spores. And so they talk about this, but eventually they found the planet where these spores came from. So they go to the teleportation chamber. So they didn't know in this comic book that it's the transporter room. Here it's the teleportation chamber. And our man Dick Wood doesn't have a really great idea about how the transporter works. You figure that out pretty quick. But so they all go into this big chamber, the teleportation chamber, and that transports them down to planet KG, also known as Planet Kelly Green. And we've got Captain Kirk, Dr. McCoy. We've got Janice Rand, who's going down to the planet. Mr. Spock is left on the Enterprise. And the first thing that happens is that we have a red shirt go through a mist. Although they're not wearing red shirts. They're all wearing these really cool jumpsuits, which is kind of cool. So according to this comic book, when they transport down to a planet, they wear this cool jumpsuit, they have backpacks, they have all this equipment. I don't think these special away team jumpsuits ever show up again, but they're kind of cool. But unfortunately, our man Hunt, the red shirt guy, immediately wanders through a mist. So we know what's going to happen to this poor guy. He immediately transforms into a horrific tree. He's transformed into a plant right away. And it's just like, man, it's terrifying. And as soon as that happens, the rest of the away team is suddenly sucked into this giant plant who has a suction power and is suctioning the away team into its giant mouth so it can eat them. So this is indeed the planet of no return. It's just a terrifying planet of horrific monstrosities. But suddenly, the plant is attacked by a bigger plant. And the bigger plant attacks this monster. So it stops suctioning them. And it kills the bigger plant, this tree creature. Unfortunately, it turns out that the tree creature is Hunt, the red shirt that was transformed into the monster, which is pretty sad. So all the characters are standing around, and Dr. McCoy says, even though poor Hunt was no longer human, he retained enough intelligence to realize our lives were in danger. And Captain Kirk says, that's why he attacked the cannibal plant, to save us. And he died doing it. So already we have tragedy here on the planet of no return. So after the tragedy, Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock are talking. And Mr. Spock says, a pity. Hunt was a great spaceman. We'll miss him. Give me your departure time, Captain, and I will have the materialization beams activated. No, we're not returning to the ship immediately, Mr. Spock. And Mr. Spock sensibly says, you cannot be serious. It is now quite obvious that planet KG is in some way responsible for this transformation phenomenon. You are all in danger there. And Captain Kirk says, perhaps we can find the key to this freak occurrence here. Meanwhile, continue to run your analysis on those 3 specimens. Very well, says Mr. Spock. You are the captain. And the captain is talking to Mr. Spock with his tricorder. He doesn't have his communicator here because I guess they didn't have a picture of the communicator. So he's just talking to him with his tricorder, which I didn't know you could do, but apparently you can. And Mr. Spock, by the way, is correct. I mean, obviously you could any moment wander through these spores here on this dangerous planet and turn into a tree. A tree monster. But Captain Kirk's like, what? It will be fine. What's the worst that can happen? So they do wander around and they find a whole village of plant people. And so we don't know, are these plant people or are these humanoids that had become plant people because of the spores? And they're attacked by trees, as soon as they find the plant people. And they have to, blast the trees with their phasers. And then they're attacked by these wandering weeds here. They're trailing us like bloodhounds, probably laying our location back to their headquarters. So, they're attacked. And so things are going quite badly. And they go even worse in a second because a tentacle, Steve is really going to like this comic because there are tentacles in it. A tentacle creeps into the cave that they're hiding in and grabs Janice Rand. So Janice Rand becomes a damsel in distress. Well, she had to be on this away mission for some purpose. And this is it. To be captured by the plant creatures. And so she's captured and she's thrown in a corral with these other animals that have not somehow become plants yet. So she's thrown into this corral, and the plants are obviously going to eat her. Now your first thought would be, well, why can't Mr. Spock just beam her up to the Enterprise? Because she's just out there in the corral. It seemed like they should be able to lock on to Janice and just beam her away, no problem. But they didn't really know how the transporter worked yet when they were writing this comic. And I think that our man Dick Wood thought that you had to be in a certain place, like, okay, this is our place, and you have to be there, and you all have to be together to teleport back to the ship. He didn't really have the idea yet that you could just lock on to an individual and beam them from the planet up to the ship. So he just didn't know how things worked. So they have to try to get her out of this barrier, but they can't do it because as they try to destroy it, it just keeps growing really quick. So they have to figure out, okay, how are we going to get her out so that we can go to our transporter, the place where we transport to the ship? By this point, Captain Kirk is like, damn, I made a mistake. Maybe it was stupid to stay here, as Mr. Spock, the sensible one, said. So they spend some time trying to figure it out. They realize that, yes, the plants do eat these animals. This is really a horrific planet. And they figure out, yes, the plants do eat these animals, and we should probably figure out a way to get her out of there. So Captain Kirk talks to Mr. Spock again, and they want to figure out, okay, maybe we could just use the ship to blast the wall of this plant corral and get her out. And he says, Mr. Spock, only Mr. Spock on the Enterprise can help Janice now. And Mr. Spock's like, you want a laser beam? You want a laser beam destruct ray pinpointed for area of 10 yards. But that's almost impossible, Captain Kirk. It's got to be possible, Mr. Spock. If the beam missed by even a foot, it can incinerate Janice, as well as the Thorn Guard fence. Our blast guns aren't strong enough for the job. Mr. Spock says, I see, you dumbass captain. We do get some nice pictures of the Enterprise. And, of course, Mr. Spock can do it. Janice, meanwhile, is being menaced by the monsters, the plant monsters. But he does manage to pinpoint the spot and laser blast the wall. And Janice is able to get out. The gigantic tumbleweeds again try to attack the crew. The bloodhound tumbleweeds. but they manage to get to the transport location and they teleport back to the ship's teleportation chamber. And this is when it gets really wild by the end of the issue. So they're back on board the ship. And Janice says, "Oh, Mr. Spock, let's get away from this dreadful planet at once, please." And Captain Kirk's like, "Yeah, I second the motion. Woo! Boy, do I suck as a captain, Mr. Spock. Maybe you should be the captain." And Mr. Spock says, "No, we're not leaving. It cannot be done yet. I have charted what can happen if those giant trees continue to emit spores through the universe. They may float through space for centuries, even light years, but someday, somewhere, they can strike other planets. When they do, that victim planet will also become a KG, with killer cannibal plants devouring for food all life upon it." And Captain Kirk says, "Golly, Mr. Spock, what is the solution?" And Mr. Spock says, "We must orbit that hideous little globe until all foliage upon it is decimated by our laser beams. I have already set a course." So Mr. Spock's solution is to destroy the planet. He's going to destroy the planet and all life on it. All the plants, all the animals, all are decimated in this horrific holocaust at the end of the first issue of Star Trek. Yes, at the end of the first issue of Star Trek, the Enterprise destroys all life on the planet. There was obviously nothing else to do, right? They had to kill everything. So, and that was not an unusual solution for an old-timey science fiction story. However, it kind of flies in the face of everything that Star Trek is about. But old Dick Wood didn't know that. And so it's interesting. That was an interesting solution to the problem. And we continue to have interesting solutions to problems in this Star Trek comic book. They do eventually start to figure things out a little bit here and there. It takes a while. They still don't have shields. Like in this issue, they're all floating around out in space trying to repair the ship because it got hit by meteorites. Things like that are weird. So when you read this, it's like reading an alternate universe version of Star Trek, which seems to be created 20 years earlier, because it's really old-fashioned as far as the kinds of adventures that are presented in this book and these original issues. They're excellent, though. They're a lot of fun. It's just strange. It's weird to see the Enterprise decimate a whole planet and all the life on it, because, that's their solution to this problem. And for several issues, the Enterprise becomes a boys' club. Janice Rand never shows up again. Poor Lieutenant Uhura doesn't show up again. And we have several issues of just a planet of the guys. A ship of the guys having adventures. Eventually, like I said, this becomes more like the television show as the creators of the comic book learned more about the show. But it always seemed a little odd. But never as odd as these earlier issues, man. These early issues are strange. And so that was the first issue of Star Trek, The Planet of No Return. Wasn't that interesting, Roger? Roger thinks it was fascinating. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.